Okay, so let's walk through this assignment, and we're just going to take a quick look at what the assignment is actually asking you to do, okay? So the very first thing we're going to look at are the objectives. What is it that they're asking you to do? What's the outcome? What's your purpose, okay, for the actual project itself? So the purpose is you're trying to figure out, is there a language barrier between scientists and the general public? So looking about the language and how they talk, is there a difference in the way that the scientists talk about a specific thing in comparison to the way the general public is able to access it? Okay, so number one, here's how you're going to go about writing this paper. Number one, you are to look up scientific issues using articles on a topic of your choice. These articles are actually going to be coming from popular news sites, and he does give you a couple on that sheet for you to be able to access some different things. One idea that I had in mind that would be something that would be very easy to point out, a language barrier, would be talking about maybe an article about diabetes and the glucose metabolic rates and how those things interact with the types of foods you eat, okay? Then you're going to look up 2 or 3 of those, okay? So those scientific, popular-based ones that you and I, just as a regular person, can go and access online, okay? Then you're going to look at the peer-reviewed article based on the same theme. So if I stick with my idea about diabetes, then I'm going to look up an article about how diabetes happens in the body, what happens with that glucose, how it metabolizes in someone with diabetes, okay? So I'm going to go to a peer-reviewed article. These peer-reviewed articles, he does give you that you do have to use the ITT virtual library, so you want to make sure that you find an article in there to get an idea. I'm not saying you have to use everything from that article, but that might be a place to go because he does say it is a requirement on your paper. So the other side of that is I use something called Google Scholar. It's an amazing website where the articles on there are peer-reviewed. So you can find medical journals and any type of article that has been peer-reviewed. So it's going to be the same type of thing but just with public access. Now that also means there might be some on there that are not free, and there might be some on there that you can't read the whole thing and you might only be able to see the abstract. But if you were to go and type into Google Scholar, it's going to pull up a new frame that looks just like Google, only it's Google Scholar. It's only got peer-reviewed articles on it. So that's another great resource that I utilize for every paper I've ever written for any type of research project. Okay, so after you read that article over your same theme, okay, you're going to rate those articles. Okay, so that was one other step that he talked about. That you're rating those articles, you're talking about how do those compare to each other. Okay, so you're going to be talking a little bit about what article was easier to understand, which one was easier to access. Now be thinking about someone that has no medical or scientific knowledge, so the average person. So be thinking at this, if you look at it from a doctor's perspective, oftentimes when I take my kids to the doctors, if I'm sitting into their office and they're having a conversation with me about what my child is diagnosed with, or maybe some issue my child is having, I want them to talk to me like a person who doesn't understand the medical ease that they might use. In this case, you're looking specifically at the science behind the conversation, okay? So I need it broken down in the way that your scientific issues articles would actually do, okay? Your peer-reviewed articles are going to be the more science-heavy based language. It's going to be the vocabulary that's a little harder to access for those individuals who don't have the training that the scientists who write those articles have, okay? So after you have read your articles on the popular news, science news areas, and peer-reviewed article and rated them on ease of access, then you're going to actually read or create a way to organize your information, okay? And I'm going to give you a very simple one, a Venn diagram. A Venn diagram is fantastic at comparing. When I look at what you are being asked to do, it's saying that they want you to compare the way that these 2 different types of articles give information about the same thing. So I'm going to use a compare-contrast paper format. Okay, so I would suggest that you use a Venn diagram. So the Venn diagram, 2 circles, okay? One side you put the science articles, and on the other side you put the peer-reviewed article. You're going to talk about some specific things that he highlights inside of your rubric that you need to address, okay? So the very first thing, you're going to, on both sides of this, okay, you've got the differences on both sides of the circle, but they also overlap in the middle. So there might be some things where they are alike, and those things you would put in the middle. So I'm going to look at number 1, information. What is the content? What does that scientific article teach you? This is your summary, okay? This is a quick, and while you're doing it in the Venn diagram, it just has to be bullets, okay? So don't think about putting it in a paragraph format quite yet. So you're going to bullet those things. What's the content? What was the purpose? Why did they write this article? And what was the audience? Who was the audience? I apologize. Who was the audience? Who were they wanting to reach out to? Okay? So be thinking about that on both sides of the scientific article versus the peer review article. That is going to be the information you're going to have for your summary. What happened in the article? Tell us a little bit about what did you learn, okay? And the next step, okay? I'm going to compare the strengths and weaknesses. What were some good things that showed up in both articles, and what were some weaknesses that showed up in both articles, okay? So I could think in my head, just as an overall basis type thing, what kinds of vocabulary did they use that would have been a strength for the science article, but would have been really horrible, or it would have been a strength for the peer review, but it would be horrible to try to talk that scientific language to someone who doesn't understand it. So that would be a weakness on the other side, okay? Be thinking about what kinds of things would make this easier for their intended audience to access, right? Now 3, format. This is where we're kind of looking at the structure. How was it set up? So if you look at those scientific news, popular news articles, they're going to be structured a little differently. And I'm talking about organization. I'm talking about the headings, look at the paragraph formatting, were there any charts and those kinds of things, and compare that to the peer-reviewed article piece. How were those structured? What were the headings like? Were there pictures? Were there questions? What were they doing to engage and pull in their reader? Okay? So you're going to compare those 2 things there. The format, you're looking at the organization, the vocabulary, and the technical details that would have made each of them stand out on their own. All right? Now once you have done this step, that's number 4, okay? Now let's review really quick. We have done read 2 or 3 scientific articles, okay, about a specific topic. You're going to use that same topic and you're going to search it up for a peer-reviewed article and read that information. Then you're going to kind of rate that on, were you able to access that? How well do you feel like readers would have been able to engage in that material? Then you want to look at building yourself a Venn diagram to be able to compare the 2 different types of articles, okay? And remember, we're walking through the summary piece, the strengths and weaknesses, and the formatting, the vocabulary, the organization, the headings, the pictures, and the technical details that make it stand out. Okay, then you're going to get into the actual paper writing. So you're going to be writing a compare and contrast paper. You're comparing the 2 different types of articles, trying to answer the question, is there a language barrier between scientists and the general public? Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of different options. I'm going to give you some, when writing a compare and contrast paper, one thing to remember is you should always start it out with your thesis, okay? You want to get our attention, but start it out with a thesis. So your thesis, based on what you find, I can infer what you're going to find, but based on what you will find, you can start it out with something like this. There is, or maybe not, there is not, a language barrier between scientists and the general public, as evidenced in comparisons of popular news sources and primary literature, which is the peer-reviewed piece that he was talking about. Okay, so that's going to be my thesis. So now I'm going to go about supporting that. And in order to do that, there's a couple of different ways that you can structure a compare and contrast paper, which will help you in the organization piece at the bottom of your rubric, okay? So he does talk about organization and being able to read your paper and have a nice flow. So in a compare and contrast paper, you can do a couple of formats. There's the point-by-point method, which is, you would say, I'm going to talk about the info from the science articles, and then I'm going to talk about the peer review one. So it would be in the science articles, blah, 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 blah. However, in the peer review, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Then we'll move on to the second. The strengths in this article were blah, 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 blah. However, or in contrast, the peer review article's strengths were da da da. So you see how I'm going point by point. Whatever I say to the article about one article, I'm going to compare it to the other side. That's point by point. Every point I make on one side is going to be compared to the other side. Okay? Or you can do the block format. So this one is kind of a little different. It's going to be a little more directed one at a time. So you're going to focus on one side first. You're going to give the summary, the strengths and weaknesses, and talk about the format. And then on the other side, you're going to, in comparison, do the peer reviews, do the same thing. So you're going to start out with one side, talk all about it, and then you would use your transition of a comparison language, and I'll send you some of those comparison and contrast verbs that you can use, or transitions I should say, sorry, not verbs. And then you can take that information and push it over to that peer review side. So then you can talk about in comparison or in contrast, the peer review articles did this, and then you would talk through each one of those specific areas, again, using that side. Okay, I will send you a few more resources, some information more about the rubric itself, looking at specific areas in the rubric that I think you need to make sure you focus on. And then I will also send you some compare and contrast language along with a sample Venn diagram that you can actually use. Okay, thank you.